For those whose eyes were glued to the news last year, especially to bridgecitynews, you know that the Freedom Convoy of 2022, which took place in Ottawa, was an unprecedented event in Canadian history and something the world had never seen before. It was an occasion for Canadians to reclaim the rights and freedoms that were suspended or taken away during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it was also quite controversial, with many who were opposed to it, which led to the federal government invoking the Emergencies Act. The vast majority of politicians went along with the government mandates, even enthusiastically supporting it. However, one former Ontario MPP did not. Randy Hillier joins me now from Ontario. So first question, what made you want to stand up and speak out against federal and provincial health mandates?
Well, I first spoke publicly in opposition when I was a member of the Ontario legislature in March of 2020. I believe it was March 26th, 2020. And it was obvious to me at that time, due to the volume of calls and inquiries into my office, that the measures that we were imposing, the lockdown measures, the mandates, were actually causing more harm than they were as any solution to the uncertainty and the fear that was being propagated. And I recognize that it was a great deal of uncertainty, but public policy needs to always be evaluated and balanced between what is the potential benefits, but what is also the potential, or in this case, known harms and injuries that we're causing people. This past weekend at the Scottish Parliament's public inquiry into their COVID measures, which were very similar to here, they have now published and commissioned a report that indicates none of the mandates, the social distancing, the masking, the lockdowns, the isolation, none of these had any beneficial impact or value during the pandemic.
Now, there was a time from April to June of 2021 in Ontario where a public gathering of just 5 people was completely illegal. And many people opposed to that health order say it was not unlike the conditions placed on criminals under house arrest. So, discussing public gatherings, you are currently facing a number of charges, one of which is under the Reopening Ontario Act. Can you just tell us what happened that led to being charged?
So, I actually received 25 different charges under the Reopening Ontario Act. For the allegation was that I organized and committed the offense of being in public and organized others to be in public. Most of those charges have eventually been stayed or withdrawn. There's 8 of them left. 2 of those were heard in the Ontario Superior Court this past week as a constitutional challenge to the validity of those orders. So, we'll have to wait for Justice John Callahan to render his decision on this. I'm somewhat optimistic that he will view and render a decision that strikes down at least portions of the Reopening Ontario Act. But each one of those charges had a maximum fine of $100,000.
Wow.
Up to a year in jail. Thankfully, most of the Crown prosecutors in Ontario have now recognized that it's not in the public interest to continue with those charges and have withdrawn them. But there are a number of local jurisdictions which are still acting in a very belligerent and aggressive manner, trying to prosecute any person who dared violate those conditions.
Now, you're currently being defended in court by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Their lawyers appeared in court on your behalf recently. So, can you just give us an update on how things went? I understand that there was an expert who testified regarding lockdown harms.
Oh, yeah, yes, we had two expert witnesses testify, Dr. Kettner and Dr. Bordash. Um, One testified to um, um, the overall harm of lockdowns, and the other one is more specific to the um, mental and harms caused by the lockdowns. Um, and Dr. Kettner also testified that um, shone a light on just how limited any of these lockdowns could have had any potential impact on the spread of the flu during 2020, 21, 2022. So I'm, I believe, I've put out a series of a thread of tweets on some of my observations of that court case. Maybe I will say this: if the judge accepts the Crown's argument, it boils down to this: that the Crown's assertion is that because the stay-at-home prohibition was just one element of a series of charter violations on people, that um, the judge ought not to consider that violation um, on its own merits, and that the Crown's assertion is if any of the violations had merit, then you can't look at any of the individual cases. So basically, if you're going to violate the charter, according to the Crown, violate it everywhere, and that makes it lawful everywhere. If you can, the legal thinking and logic behind the Crown's argument was reprehensible at best, and at a minimum juvenile.
Now, you've had some success with the JCCF in the past. You were talking about originally having 25 charges, and now you're down to 8. Some of those charges were against you and former MP Derek Sloan. Those were dropped at the end of June. Now, do you feel vindicated with those charges being dropped?
Well, I'm thankful that they're dropped because, as you can appreciate, I'm not a wealthy man. Um, and the potential fines of $2.5 million is not something that one would ever want to face, as well as up to 25 years in jail. So I'm thankful that they're withdrawn. I don't know if I would say vindicated yet, um, because I know, and the whole purpose behind many of these charges was for me to get the matter in front of a court quickly and have the constitutionality of it tested. And obviously, it didn't happen quickly. It's only now being tested in the courts. So I think in the days ahead, and I think many people view that I have been vindicated. I think it would be really, really good if Canada as a whole and our governments as a whole recognize that our response to COVID was unjustified, unlawful, illegal, and caused more harm to others. And all those people who spoke up who should be applauded for having that fortitude and courage to speak up during the pandemic, not be treated as pariahs or criminals.
Now, in my opening, I discussed the events that took place in Ottawa early last year. The mainstream media was not always in attendance at a lot of those press conferences that were being held during that time, and many people were concerned that the MSM would attempt to misreport or even derail some of these press conferences. So do you feel that the media coverage that was done early last year in Ottawa was done objectively, or do you feel that it was biased?
Well, listen, it wasn't just in Ottawa, for the entirety, say, from the beginning of March of 2020, the media took a very uh, antagonistic approach and belligerent approach to anybody who was dissenting from the mandates or who were not applauding these lockdowns and violations. And as we can see, we saw uh, many examples where the mainstream media would um, intentionally disrupt, denigrate, and dismiss anyone who opposed these mandates. So that was certainly, um, and also amplify the falsehoods of the government um, in um, in characterizing opposition. If the government really believed that this was such a threat to people's health and that there was uncertainty about this pandemic, that is a time when you must rely on debate and discussion to find out what you ought to be doing. Uh, when so all these Project Vitality out of Stanford, the Twitter files, the Facebook files, all these things are proof points that the government knew what they were doing was wrong, and they put on a full court press on any dissents and any opposition to what they knew that what they were doing was unlawful.
So the reason why I asked the question about media coverage, because I'm curious that in the court proceedings against you, did the Crown cite any coverage from the media in their arguments? And do you feel that the sources contained factual and accurate information that was used against you?
But there was certainly much media uh, um, excerpts and whatnot, documents that were part of the Crown's case, um, and you know, I would say that although some of it was factual, or in all of the images were factual, the narrative and the storyline was often just a total fabrication.
So just one more question, because we're almost out of time here. They say that history repeats itself, and so we may not be able to avoid another pandemic or outbreak, but is there anything Canadians can do to prevent lockdowns and restrictions that we experienced due to the COVID-19 pandemic to happen again?
Oh, absolutely. And listen, I'm not, what we just went through in the last few years um, was not a pandemic. There was a pandemic of fear. There was a pandemic of falsehoods. But there was, the evidence bears this out now that um, we, as a Western society, took a seasonal respiratory viral flu um, and created a mountain of fear out of that. There is only one way for people to um, constrain government and prevent government from acting unlawfully, and that is to be independently knowledgeable, to view things critically, to become informed and knowledgeable about how our system actually works. Um, they could
Right.
do a few other things: turn off the mainstream media, obviously, put down the smartphone from time to time, and become better informed, uh, and and become more engaged and understand how to engage the political process to get your elected members to actually do their job to advocate for your interests.
Well, Randy, we're all out of time, but we really appreciate having you on our show today, and hearing about the progress you've made with your matters. So, thank you for being with us today.
Well, let me add, if anybody wants, I'd like to put a little plug in. I'm helping to inform people through my own podcast called Scuttlebutt Lodge. You can tune in. I share my own personal observations of political life, and I also have you can go to No More Lockdown CA to see those videos, and also if you wanted to spend a little time at my camp and at Scuttlebutt Lodge here in Lanark County.